And I'm going to talk today about the possibility of a double headshot, which was originally raised by several researchers, most notably, I think, Thompson, many years ago. We've always pointed to the double motion of the President's head, the second component in the backwards direction, as evidence that two gunshots were responsible for these motions, and the second one coming from the front. Previous reviews of the autopsy-related materials done by governmental panels, most recently the Forensic Pathology Panel of the HSCA, have concluded that only one bullet struck from behind. There are several problems with this interpretation, though, mainly that the entry point does not coincide with where the autopsy doctors documented an entry point. It would require a jacketed bullet such as CE-399 to uncharacteristically fragment extensively. And additionally, a single impact would have to cause two temporally separate movements of the head in opposite directions. This has necessitated some fanciful explanations, such as some nebulous neuromuscular reaction, which I don't think anyone's ever fully elucidated, or reverse jet effects, which I will show later do not apply to this case. Today I'd just like to provide an alternate explanation based upon simple findings that can be easily appreciated on the materials that reveal fundamental flaws made by previous interpreters of this evidence. First, I'd like to show that the HSCA's proposed entry wound at the cowlick area is in fact an impact point for a bullet, second bullet which fragmented coming from the front of the motorcade. And we can do this simply by correctly orienting the largest skull fragment recovered from the assassination. And again, you've probably all seen this many times. There's 312, a forward motion with particulate matter being expelled after an initial wound, which then quickly reverses in a backwards direction after a brief pause of approximately a sixth of a second. But in all, 5 fragments of bone were recovered from the assassination, 3 of them from the rear of the limousine, which I don't like these abbreviations now, and I wish I'd change them, but there's 3 fragments in the limousine. Limousine fragments, largest, middle, and small. And unfortunately, those are not coming through real well, but really, this is the one we have to worry about. We have the Harper fragment here, which has been discussed earlier today, and there is a ruler there, so if someone wants to find the exact dimensions, you can get them off of that. And the Weitzman fragment, which may be the Burroughs fragment, that was only described in Seymour Weitzman's Warren Commission testimony, where we discussed the recovery of a skull fragment immediately after the assassination in or near the roadway. But the fragment which is the most critical one is the largest fragment recovered, which was found in the rear seat of the limousine. It was taken to the autopsy room. It was x-rayed. It was examined by the autopsy pathologist. And what they saw was external beveling in one corner with some small metallic fragments in the same area. They also noted the presence of a portion of a cranial suture in a portion of this fragment, which will become very important because the presence of that suture only allows a very limited number of orientations in the skull. I would like to point out that every review panel has agreed that this piece of bone has a portion of an exit wound in one corner. There is no dissension on that. Now, the way we can do this is we can look at the cranial sutures, or we can do it an easier way, and that's just watch the Zapruder film, because the Zapruder film documents where and when each skull fragment was ejected from the head. And we can make it even easier. The ITEC study did this for us. Not only did they demonstrate 2 separate motions of the head in opposite directions, but they also looked at the particulate matter ejected from the skull. Here, there's another one which shows the smaller particulate matter going down, but there's one arising from the mid-parietal region, the other from the front. There may be 2 fragments there. Whether or not there is really not crucial to this discussion, because the most important thing is you have a multiplicity of fragments coming out of the front of the head. There's a small one directed downwards, which is not going to show well for anybody. But the Harper fragment we know we can localize because on its inner surface there are arterial impressions which are characteristic of branches of the middle meningeal artery, just arteries that feed the covering of the skull. And they have a fairly characteristic branching pattern. And that allows us to determine that it fit in the mid-parietal region. Now, probably the most important observation one can make on, on frame 313 is the top rear of the President's head has remained intact. Nothing has been ejected from the top rear of the President's head. Now we know from, and it is agreed upon by all of the review panels and myself, that the x-rays and photographs show that bone is missing in this area. And the question arises is, when does this bone come out and what piece of bone is it? Well, if we look at later frames of the Zapruder film, and just keep that in mind because we actually have an x-ray of that skull fragment, and we know that a piece of bone has not been accounted for by the ITEC study because, unfortunately, they stopped their analysis for particulate matter before they had accounted for all the skull fragments, which is quite a big error because this is the largest fragment which was ejected from the skull that day. Again, multiplicity of fragments out the front, no damage to the rear, large fragment unaccounted for. And if we look here, we can see this fragment going across the trunk of the limousine right there. Has a 90-degree corner, convex border, keeps its shape as it slides across the trunk of the limousine. There were eyewitnesses to the fact that this was a piece of skull. Here again, we can also measure it because I know from diagrams the distance of the headrest here. You can do comparative measurements, and you can see that, or if you want to, as I've done, you'll see that it has the same size, shape, and configuration as the fragment which was taken to the autopsy room and which has been universally agreed upon as having a portion of an exit wound in one corner. And we have just documented it coming off the top rear of the President's head. Here, the fragment, actually there's a little bump. A few years ago, someone told me there's an aerial things that come up and it's switched, but it still has the same configuration. If you watch it, we all have seen Jacqueline Kennedy going out on the trunk of the limousine recovering this fragment, bringing it back into the rear seat of the limousine where it was subsequently recovered. Now, there's another way that we can validate this conclusion, and that is by the cranial sutures, which I talked about previously. This severely limits the number of orientation that this fragment has, and very fortunately, the suture area line pretty much lines up with the corner that has the exit fragment in it and the lead fragments. I would like to stop here for just a second and say, Dr. Ron here, I would just love for him to tell me what the antimony and lead content of this lead fragment is. He's never analyzed it. No one has ever analyzed it because it wasn't recovered. Neither was the large lead fragment that we'll see in the top rear of the head, which corresponds to the same impact point. So I think for someone to stand here and say that he can mathematically eliminate any possibility of a second gunshot wound, considering the fact that he does not have all the lead fragments to analyze, is a bunch of bunk. You know, it actually is an insult to my intelligence. He had two small fragments from the front of the head, which probably characteristically may have come from the shot from behind. And we'll look at the x-rays later. But for someone to come up, and then also what I thought was very interesting was he said, it didn't matter where or how many bullets struck the head. Now, I think that if a forensic pathologist shows that there are two entry wounds in the head, we can assume that two bullets went through, but he's not, I guess that doesn't have any bearing on him. I would wonder if he went to the George Lundberg School of Forensic Pathology. Anyway, back to the analysis of the suture lines. This is one that Dr. Bodden would like to say is the analysis, they said it's always the coronal suture because they assumed, since they only had one exit wound, that of course this had to fit in the front of the head. Well, unfortunately, the exit wound in the front of the head, which I agree is present, came from a bullet from behind, is 5.5 centimeters to the right of midline. Well, there's not enough skull missing across the midline to accommodate this fracture. And additionally, if they had bothered to look at the Zapruder film, they would know that multiple fragments arose from the same area. It is impossible, looking at frame 313 of the Zapruder film, that one single fragment arose from the front of the head at the coronal suture, which could have somehow been recovered in the rear of the limousine. It just makes no sense whatsoever. The other orientation, if we want to keep it in the front of the head desperately so that, somehow we can still, keep the exit wound up front, we can have the sagittal suture here that runs along the midline at the top of the skull and have that exit corner directed up front. That would have a bullet exiting pretty much near the midline at the top of the head. And neither I nor any of the review panels have ever found any evidence that a bullet exited at this location. This is the unfortunate location that Dr. Angel, the forensic pathologist who is a consultant for the, forensic anthropologist who is a consultant for the forensic pathology panel, he placed it in front of the coronal suture. Now, every review panel, including myself, agrees that the frontal bone is virtually intact, with the bullet having exited just near the coronal suture. The consultant that the forensic pathology panel used as a forensic anthropologist had no idea where areas of skull were present or missing on the JFK skull x-rays. And he was wrong. We'll get to see his diagram later. The only other remaining orientation is with the sagittal suture directed backwards along the sagittal suture, with this corner being present in the top rear of the presence head, right at the spot where the HSCA says a bullet entered, and where there is a 6.5 millimeter lead fragment, which has gone unretrieved and unanalyzed, at the same spot. And this exactly matches what we see on the Zapruder film, with the front of the head having exploded initially, and this portion not being removed until after ITEC demonstrated a second force was applied in the backwards direction. And again, this fragment had external beveling and metallic fragments. A fragmenting bullet coming from this front struck the top rear of the head, forcing the presence head backwards. It wasn't a result of neuromuscular reactions. It wasn't a result of reverse jet effects. It wasn't a result of the car within 1/18th of a second accelerating. And it wasn't from Jackie pushing his head back in some violent manner. Now, I think I've pretty much discredited HSCA's entry wound up high. It doesn't correspond to where the autopsy doctors said a point of entry was. And I would just like to go over and look at the evidence that the autopsy doctors provided us to look at where a bullet might have entered. And what they documented was an entry hole slightly above the external occipital protuberance, 2.5 centimeters to the right of the midline. They did not measure the upward distance. However, we have and I might say one thing which I mentioned before in my previous talk, was that the autopsy doctors have had an advantage that I haven't had, none of the forensic pathologists have had who have reviewed this material, in the fact that they had the body in front of them for hours. They could manipulate the scalp. They could take the pieces of bone, look at them inside and out, and there are no pictures in the limited autopsy photographs which demonstrate this. They've seen things, and they've described things that no one has ever seen except them. So they document an entry hole at the EOP. This is completely consistent with, and it's not at the cowlick area. When they presented with these x-rays by the forensic pathology panel, they said, no, this is not the entry, it has to be lower. By the way, right in here is that 6.5 millimeter fragment that went unanalyzed. This one went unanalyzed. All of these, no one has ever found what the lead or antimony content of all these fragments are. So when someone tells me that they can rule out a second gunshot to the wound to the head, I don't buy it. Here's a drawing that Dr. Humes made presumably without the help of the photographs or x-rays, but I'd like to point out that this is another wound slightly above the EOP, and there's bone intervening between it and the large defect at the top of the skull. The HSCA incorporates the entry hole at the edge of the large defect. Here again is another one. This is on the skin surface, but entry hole slightly above the EOP with bone or intervening between it and the large defect at the top rear, well, at the rear of the, on the right side of the head, excuse me. Here's a skull that was marked by them for the forensic pathology panel. Now, just remember that this is 15 years after the assassination. 3 different people marked this skull, and there is tremendous unanimity about where this bullet entered. Not up here, down here. And remember, these were the fellows who had the skull in their hands. And then there's the photographs, which we've gone around and around with, but when they presented this photographs to Dr. Humes, I think most of the members of the House Forensic Pathology panel were astounded when they said, no, that's not an entry wound up there. This is the entry wound. And the lesion in the skull corresponds to that area there, which is something overlying the scalp. Whether that precisely correlates to the entry hole, I can't say for certainty. I can only take their word for it. I do know that if you do place some material on the back of your head at the EOP and extend your head backwards, that there's an accordion effect which will make it go much lower than one would expect. Now, some of you may have seen this before, but when I looked at these films, I was looking at this drawing and I said, you know, in all the meticulous detail, they forgot a fracture down here, right here, which just happens to be at the level that the autopsy doctor said a bullet entered. Not one radiologist who has examined these x-rays for the government has ever mentioned this fracture. And I would like to point out that this just isn't any fracture. You know, I didn't pick a fracture up here or a fracture down there, whatever. Fracture right here, right where the autopsy doctors said a bullet entered. And actually this got put in sideways, but for most people who aren't radiologists it might work out better. Just pretend this is the right side of the head. Normally it would be reversed if you're a radiologist, but that's some idiosyncrasy that we have. But in any case, here's that large fragment that corresponds to the area where this large piece of skull was removed, right here. Now, could that fracture have been created by a bullet? I believe so. Other people believe so. Certainly the autopsy doctors do, because it says in their autopsy report that fractures emanated from the hole of entry. Now, there is a principle called Puppe's phenomenon, P-U-P-P-E''S, that states that pre-existing fractures will stop the propagation of secondary fractures, and I think Roger Feynman demonstrated that yesterday, by the pre-existing gap in the bone. And if we look here at this impact point, a fracture extends across the midline, and it's interrupted by this fracture, which is continuation of the fracture of the right occipital bone. And in my opinion, this fracture stops at, here's the transverse fracture here, and here's its continuation up this way, and I believe it stopped at this point. So that means that this fracture was the first fracture created in the skull. This manifest Puppe's phenomenon. It authenticates or validates the autopsy doctor's location of an initial wound of entrance low in the rear of the head. However, if a bullet entered here, then what struck here? In my view, it was a fragmenting bullet which stuck to the front and drove the president's head backwards. You might also realize that this piece of bone here has been lifted and pushed backwards from the rest of the remaining skull. And is it surprising that we don't see any metal fragments at the entry point? You know, you can't have it both ways. These bullets were made, according to Geneva Conventions, not to fragment. Can they fragment? Yes. But if it behaved characteristically as it should have, it does not surprise me that there are no fragments present at this spot. And it could have entered, created a fracture, and continued on through the front of the head, leaving no visible evidence of its trail. And now I'd just like to show you what I think is a sequence of events based upon the x-rays, and the Zapruder film and the known fragments which were recovered from the assassination. At frame 312, 313, a jacketed bullet entered low in the rear of the head at a point described by the autopsy team, did not fragment on entry, and created a transverse fracture. It exited the front rear of the skull. During its passage, it created a temporary pressure cavity, which caused tremendous increase in the pressure inside the skull, which eventually burst the front of the skull out, distributing several fragments, well, at least 2 fragments into Dealey Plaza, this being the Harper fragment because we know from arterial markings that it had to fit in the middle of the head, and other fragments out from in front of that one, leaving the top rear of the head intact. If a bullet had actually entered here and created a pressure cavity, all of the fractures would have been generated by that initial bullet strike. And as such, this fragment of bone back here underlying the scalp, which has remained undisturbed, would have been a loose, free fragment. I would have expected at least some motion of the scalp in the rear or ejection of that fragment as eventually occurred. One might question which is greater in force, the huge temporary pressure cavity which rockets bullets from bone fragments from the head at 80 miles per hour, or some reverse jet effect or neuromuscular reaction which happened to make it move in the backwards direction. But this accounts for no metallic fragments here. That's why it's been so obscure to other people, because one, as far as I know, no forensic pathologist was ever given the data by a forensic radiologist that a fracture existed there. They just assumed, since it was such a nice, big, obvious wound here, that that was the point where the wound existed, and somehow the autopsy doctors missed the entry point by several centimeters. Secondly, bullet entered the hole created by the first exit point, hit the top rear of the head, fragmenting it, struck the rear, depositing metallic fragments at this point in the intact skull, as well as in the corner of the large fragment of skull that it removed, which went across the back of the head. And again, this fragment has been universally accepted by me and every review panel as having a portion of an exit wound in its corner. One other thing that Roger brought up that I would like to point out too is that you know, I mentioned it in the autopsy pathologist drawings, they said that there was bone intervening between the entry hole and the large defect at the vertex. Well, if you read carefully, as I have done through many of the eyewitness testimony, our inspector was questioning Roy Kellerman, a Secret Service agent, who was an eyewitness to the autopsy, and he asked him, what was the distance which separated the large hole at the vertex with the small hole of entry? Roy Kellerman indicated a distance of 2 inches. This is exactly the amount of bone which intervenes between the transverse fracture and the impact point at this higher thing. I don't think Roy Kellerman was hallucinating what he saw. It fits the x-rays and photographs exactly. Now, here is a rendition from the House Select Committee, or the Forensic Pathology Panel, about their pattern of damage to the skull. They have a single bullet entering up here at a point not documented by the autopsy team. The bullet uncharacteristically fragmenting, exiting the front of the head, exploding fragments out. Nowhere on the Zapruder film are you ever going to see a single large fragment arising from the front of the head. By the presence of the suture, it has to fit in the rear of the head, and everyone agrees it is a point where a bullet exited the skull. It had to have come from the front. They didn't know that there was a fracture immediately underlying the point on the scalp where the doctor said a entry hole was, and where the damage caused by another bullet, a non-fragmenting bullet, completely consistent with those other ones fired from behind. This is Dr. Lawrence Angel, who was the forensic anthropologist who places the large fragment in front of the coronal suture. Now, even Dr. Bodden and Dr. Davis, who created this diagram, knew that the frontal bone was intact. Yet, they didn't go back to Dr. Angel and say, Dr. Angel, you know, could you kind of reassess this, because where you have put this bone, There's bone there already. It can't arise from there. But no, they just slipped this in anyway. I think it was getting late, and they just really didn't want to be bothered because they had their minds made up. Now, I'd like to show you something that I've interpreted these films as a radiologist. Other people can look at them. They can make comments, and some of the, I think that you really have to cover everything. And that is, at this point, there's a small area which would appear to be a violation of Pupp's phenomenon. This fracture here is actually a fracture of the zygomatic arch and inferior orbital rim on the right. And by the way, this is switched now because in radiology we put the right side on the left and the left side on the right when looking at the patients. And this is a blow-up of it. Now, this is not the best one, but in my estimation, the edges of this fracture here, which are in the occipital area, are sharply defined. This one here is fuzzier, and the direction of propagation of this fracture does not line up with this fracture. So it's my opinion that Pupp's phenomenon still exists. If I wanted to play games, I could say, well, geez, that's where the bullet entered, and that's just a fracture created by the first bullet's entry. I really can't see a bullet hole. I wish I could, but I can say that the fracture down low manifests Pupp's phenomenon and means it was a primary fracture created by the first bullet. Where exactly along that fracture line the bullet entered, I don't know. But Pupp's phenomenon says that that fracture was created first and a bullet had to have entered at that level initially. The second bullet struck up high, causing radiating fractures which isolated and finally freed the top rear of the skull, which we've seen was ejected onto the trunk of the limousine only after the ITEC study shows a second force being applied to the head. Now, about the neuromuscular reaction. We've got the goat shoot film. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but the Warren Commission decided that, we need some answers here, some explanations. So they anesthetize a goat, which is a quadruped. They anesthetize it, and then they restrain its head, and they shoot it. And they showed some motion of its extremities. Now, how this is applicable to the Kennedy assassination, I don't know, because for one, I don't see his arms flailing around at the time he was shot in the head. And two, I would expect the goat's head to move, and it didn't. And if there are any animal on this planet that has strong muscles that would cause the head to go backwards, it's a goat, because it holds its head out horizontally all its life. Those are very strong muscles. So the goat shoot has no, neuromuscular reaction. The only neuromuscular reaction that occurred is one that selectively isolated those muscles which were so desperately needed by the House Select Committee to cause a backwards motion of the head. No other muscles in JFK's body were activated, but somehow this neuromuscular reaction just happened to get those muscles which will pull the head backwards. Now, that is voodoo science. I think we've seen a lot of that here today, actually. Now, the other cause is the reverse jet effect. And, this was done by John Latimer. The only thing that John Latimer did with his shooting of skulls was he shot himself in the foot. The reason why is that Latimer filmed his shots at hundreds of frames per second. The other thing that we found out 10 years ago was he filled those skulls with paint. Okay, it is a liquid substance which reflects the energy much better than a gelatin or something that actually resembles the brain substance. And when he did, he pulverized the skulls, and yes, he did get them to go backwards, but they went backwards too fast, because the only thing that John Latimer showed, that if there were a reverse jet effect, it would have manifested itself on the very first frame after the initial impact. And we don't see that. It is a delayed backward motion. And that delay, whether it's 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds, when it comes to explosions and reverse jet effects, that is way past the time than we would have seen them. So reverse jet effects don't work. Neuromuscular reactions don't work. I cannot see this car accelerating so quickly in such a short period of time. And I never see Jacqueline Kennedy's arms move up to hit his head to move it backwards somehow. And basically it was a simple fact, which some people would like to dispute, that John F. Kennedy was shot by two different bullets in two different directions in synchronized manner. The one from behind is completely consistent with CE 399, went through. If it fragmented, it may have fragmented on exit, but certainly it didn't fragment when it first entered. The second bullet was a fragmenting bullet which hit the top rear of the head, depositing lead fragments and removing that last portion of the skull, which everyone has agreed has a portion of an exit wound in a corner, and which can be clearly seen, compared, measured as one and the same with the bone analyzed by the autopsy doctors who said, along with every review panel, that it had a portion of an exit wound in it. Here's an x-ray of the Harper fragment. I did show this 10 years ago. And I can really take this analysis a lot further. I really don't have the time now. But I can go into square centimeters of bone loss, the contours of the bone, the various fracture lines. The one thing that I would like to point out, though, is that this is the front of the president's head, this is the rear of the president's head. There is a concave rear border to the Harper fragment. The portion of bone that was left behind has a convex border on the front. When the Harper fragment was blown off, its concave border fit and left a convex border in the complementary portion of skull that was still left behind. And the analysis can go further and further and further, but basically it was 2 bullets causing 2 motions of the head, 2 shots from 2 different directions, and there's only one conclusion, and that was that JFK was killed as a result of conspiracy. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Perhaps I was the one who pointed out to you some years ago that there was an antenna back there. But what I did point out to you at the time was that when you look at the film, the version of the Zapruder film that you showed when you first gave this paper at COPA, was that when that white blob you're calling a fragment gets to that antenna, you can see the antenna through it, which then indicates that it is in fact some kind of an optical reflection rather than a bone fragment. Second point on that is that you can pick up that white blob on the back of the car, if you look at the Zapruder film very carefully, before the head explodes, thereby making it almost impossible for it to be a bone fragment. Thank you.
I would just refer you to the Nix film. Josiah Thompson in 6 Seconds in Dallas saw the same particulate matter ejected onto the trunk of the limousine. Given the fact that there is very little scalp that is removed from the head, there's only 2 possibilities for that. It's either brain tissue or skull. The only type of matter which will slide across smoothly and evenly across the trunk of a limousine is skull. I would suggest that you go to your local grocery store, buy some fresh brains, get them at room temperature, and try to slide them across the trunk of your car.
Sir, it's just a reflection. You can see the antenna through it.
Yeah, but I just want to make sure that there is no doubt that that is a piece of bone. There is no other conclusion that anyone can make. And yes, you can see it in the Nix film. And Josiah Thompson, and just someone showed the Nix film a few days ago, and you can see it sliding across. And it has to end up in the trunk of the limousine. Jacqueline recovered it. And unbeknownst to everyone who's examined this, they never went to the Zapruder film to check their conclusions. They just said, oh, one exit in front, part of an exit hole, obviously it has to fit in front. But you know what? This shows you the tremendous evidentiary value of the Zapruder film and the Nix film and their photograph of the assassination that's available. I think it's over here.
Oh, I'm Rob Stewart. I'm a pathologist, and I put skulls back together from gunshot wounds. The only way you can tell where that piece of bone came from is to put it back in the skull. That's the only way you can tell where it came from, in my experience. Also, the middle meningeal artery impressions on the inside table of the skull are most prominent on the side here, not up here,
No,
and certainly not in the front.
it is a Harper fragment that has the branches of the middle meningeal artery. And by the way, the gentleman standing right behind you is Tink Thompson, and he interviewed Dr. Boswell in 1967. Dr. Boswell's statement was this, that he was able to orient that fragment the night of the autopsy. It lined up so that a portion of the skull lined up along the midline so that it was directed to the top rear of the president's head.
The other question I have is, if also I see one snow pattern, if you will, of a high-velocity rifle weapon in this X-rays that you show. If there was a second impact, where is the second snow pattern? And then also in the Zapruder film, there's only one burst that I can see. I don't see a second burst, which would come from a second exit. And then that raises the question, if the exit is up here, where is the entrance? Would it be down here? Would it be in the face? Would it be in the front of the head, side?
Okay.
Which could make it impossible.
You raised a very good point, and that is there is only one explosion, and that is from the first bullet. And that is because at that time the skull was confined. Any other bullets that would have hit after that would not have had a confined space to make a temporary pressure cavity. And the fact that there's no metallic fragments, I really don't put much weight in that at all, because one, you could fire CE 399 through a skull and not see one piece of lead. Apparently. I mean, right, there's characteristics and uncharacteristics. You can't make hard and fast rules, but it doesn't surprise me that there's no lead down low. It is my opinion that most likely, I mean, we do not have the complete evidence available, but I think we can arrive at reasonable conclusions, and that is the second shot from the front most likely entered the hole made by the first bullet. And you have to ask yourself, why does the top rear of the head resist the tremendous pressure cavity that was created by that first bullet? And the reason why is that there were no fractures present at the top of the head that would have isolated that fracture at that point in time. It is only after the second force is applied, the fractures are created, that that piece comes loose.
I have a question. I want to know if either of the two radiologists who originally were consulted to look at the photos and x-rays I know for a fact that one of them is still alive. Were they ever approached about the fact that they missed the transverse fracture at the back of the skull?
Well, it's a funny story. The first radiologist, Dr. Ebersol, is dead. The radiologist for the Clark panel is dead. But David O. Davis, who was responsible for the diagram for the HSCA, had the opportunity to review this article for the journal Radiology. And he did not want to acknowledge even the fact that a fracture was there. And as such, my article was denied.
What about Dr. Norman Chase?
Well, Norman Chase, I believe, was with the HSCA. There was actually about 3 radiologists for the HSCA. Why they didn't report it, I mean...
No, I mean, was he approached afterward that, you know, that he missed a fracture?
No, I don't think that any of these people... I've not approached them. I mean, besides running it through journals trying to get it published, I haven't gone back and called people up and say, hey, dummy, you missed a fracture, you know. There's one other thing, too. There's trajectory lines which are on this skull x-ray, which point exactly to the entry wound. And they match CE 388 to the degree. Now, I think it is, you know, there's coincidences in this world. I don't consider that a coincidence when John Ebersol is called to the White House to draw lines on the skull x-rays, and about 2 weeks later, Dr. Humes makes a drawing that has those very same lines pointing to the fracture that lies at the level where they showed an entry wound was present. Mm-hmm. And whether or not they saw the photographs and x-rays to create those things, I don't know. But it sure is one heck of a coincidence if it is.
I'm not disputing the fact that the fracture is there. I'm a radiologist. My husband's a neuroradiologist. We both see the fracture. I'm just, and it's also not unusual for radiologists to get on the phone and call each other and say, hey, you know, I just saw a case that you saw, and by the way, you know, you missed it. I was just curious if they were approached. I'm not debating the fact that there's a fracture there.
Right. No, I don't think any radiologist who looks at that, you know, when you point it out, it's like it's there. There's no question that it's there. But no, I haven't called them up. Tink?
Randy, I want to compliment you. You wrote, wow, this was really great. However, I want to amend something. I mean, as the guy who measured the double movement, I am now convinced that those figures are incorrect. And I'm no longer convinced that the Zapruder film really shows any forward movement of the head subsequent to 312. That's due to a bullet hit. If you could put up 313 and let me point to parts of it with a with the laser pointer.
You know, if they would, I don't know how to activate this to get the slides up, but there is a copy. There's 313.
Okay, if I could come down and take the laser pointer, I could show you what this is about. Now notice, in 313, there's a jiggle or smear. Notice it here. In other words, this should be a point. It's a smear. Now when you translate that to this long white area, it means that you get a horizontal smear, which means that when you're measuring the back of the president's head, right, you're measuring the front end of that smear. The result of that is that you make a mistake, that you believe that there's an actual movement where there is no movement of the head. This was first shown to me by Art Snyder, who's been mentioned several times tonight. And David Wimp has done some wonderful work on this, and it's on the internet. David Wimp's conclusion is that you have very modest forward movement of the head beginning, I think, around 3/8, and that movement is then overwhelmed about, it's either between 313 and 314 or between 314 and 315, and I just don't remember right now. But I'm convinced from this very good work of these people that I can't see any real evidence on the Zapruder film right now. Pardon me? I'd have difficulty making any measurements on the Nix film of that kind of head movement, because basically I think my figures all these years ago was only 2 inches.
Yeah, that's what I text.
And that's going to be, I mean, that's going to be almost indiscernible on the Nix film. Anyhow, I just want, yeah, please.
Whether or not there is a demonstrable forward movement of the head, I think needs to be looked at. But in either case, what we see at this frame is a result of a explosive wound created by a temper pressure cavity from a first bullet's entry. I don't think we can both agree that.
Sure,
now,
right.
we still have the problem that the head goes backwards.
Yes.
And I can't relate the initial bullet strike with that motion for the various reasons that I put forth here. And again, there's many things that need to be delved in further, but in my own mind, looking at the whole situation with the autopsy doctors, the x-rays, the photographs, the Zapruder film, is that there's only one conclusion for me, and that is that 2 bullets struck the president from 2 different directions.
And we haven't mentioned here what Mr. Feynman pointed out yesterday, which is directly relevant. We haven't mentioned here in this little colloquy what Mr. Feynman pointed out yesterday. Exactly. Exactly. We haven't even mentioned that.
What he mentioned was in Roger Feynman's, he's right there, is that if you look very carefully, and he toggled it back and forth, at 3:15, the hair having been essentially motionless prior to that, there is a start of the scalp being elevated just at 3:15. It is at 3:15 that the ITEC study says that a second force was applied to the president's head. It would seem that the Zapruder film substantiates that second force, and the question is what caused it? And what it was a fragmenting bullet fired from the front, from the grassy knoll, or from the front of the motorcade. Thank you.